Yeah, so you can see from the title of this presentation that I want to address a little bit of the notion of what we discussed yesterday of theory of surprise. The one thing that I want to make a disclaimer initially, and it applies for the whole presentation, is this is not going to present a theory of surprise. It's going to present some of the ideas that underlie what will ultimately, hopefully, become such a theory. And the first point that I want to emphasize is that this term surprise is a very slippery one in the sense that there is no one-size-fits-all definition of surprise, just like there is no such definition for complexity, there is no such definition for resilience, there is no such definition for a lot of very useful everyday words. So I'm going to skip past the idea of a definition of surprise. I think that we all have a sense of what a surprise is, but it's not the same sense. Like, for example, yesterday was a good example. A couple of people in this room mentioned they were pretty surprised that it rained last night. And I wasn't surprised at all. I would have been surprised if it had not rained last night. So that single event, which we can all agree on, rain last night in Vienna, was for some a surprise and others not. So if you talk about a theory of surprise, it is with respect to something, just like resilience. There's no such thing as a system being resilient without further amplification. You can only be resilient with respect to something, with respect to a particular kind of shock or with respect to a particular kind of structure. And it's the same with this notion of surprise. So that having been said, let me make a small step to distinguish what I would think of as the unexpected versus the surprising. They're not the same thing. Unexpected, for me anyway, these are my definitions, for example, is something a lot stronger than just a surprise. And X event is an excellent example of this distinction, because if you talk about a surprising event, it doesn't necessarily, by its nature, have a social impact. It may have no impact at all. That business with the rain last night, it had only the impact for a handful of people who didn't take their umbrellas to the restaurant. But otherwise, no social impact at all to speak of, at least for us. On the other hand, an X event, by its nature, is surprising. So every X event is a surprise, but it has some other features as well. It's rare. It happens very infrequently, and it has, in general, a major social impact in terms, it could be good or negative. It could be something like deaths or money, or it could be something like the development of agriculture, uniformly beneficial to humans in general. So, so I'm just putting this up here to sort of give you some sense of the fact that definitions are tricky. And before you start thinking about a theory of anything, you have to sort of put your cards on the table and basically say, this is what I mean by anything. And in fact, I think it's really, to be truthful, a waste of time to try and think about a one-size-fits-all uniform definition of any concept that is going to be used in discourse. I think that it's more productive to just say, you can always argue with a definition no matter what it is. You can make any kind of definition you want. What matters is whatever definition you use, is it useful? Does it lead to some kind of useful product, useful outcome? So since we're not philosophers here, I'm not going to make those kind of definitions. But I hope that I can show you why certain things are useful. So what are we, when we talk about surprise, what are we actually looking for? We're looking at the occurrence of events. And we're trying to get some insight into either predicting when a surprising event might occur, or probably more realistic, to anticipate when we're in the neighborhood of something that could turn out a lot differently than what we expect, a lot differently. And so in this regard, I'll make a claim, which I think I made yesterday also, that all events, whether they're unexpected X events, ordinary events, or anything else, events are a change of state. And all events stem from two things: a landscape, the context within which the event takes place, and a random trigger which distinguishes from all the possibilities. See, the landscape just tells you what is possible at the next time period. And not everything is equally likely, but some things are literally impossible if they involve contravening laws of nature, if they involve inconsistent, saying, you know, water is going to go uphill and downhill at the same time, or things of that kind. So some things are just not possible, but the context specifies all of the things that are possible. It doesn't mean they're all equally likely, far from it, but it's all the things that are possible. The random trigger comes in and picks out from that spectrum of all possibilities what you actually get, what you actually see in the next period. And those of you who have any familiarity with quantum theory will recognize this immediately, because that's exactly the way nature works as well, down at the quantum level. You have the context there is specified by the Schrödinger wave function, which basically specifies all the possibilities and how likely each one is. And when, according to one of the main interpretations in quantum theory, when you open up the box and look in, all of these possibilities vanish. This wave function collapses to a single point, and that point is the event that you actually see, that you actually observe. This is what the famous Schrödinger cat experiment is all about. And it's this, I will argue it's exactly the same in human processes as well, except that observational aspect plays a much more, not important role, but it's more at the macro level. Okay, so context and random trigger. The drivers of context, I talked about this yesterday, so I'm just going to show this and say a couple words, are two factors. I don't claim that this list is exhaustive. There may be other factors as well, but the two very crucial factors are what I told you yesterday about too much complexity. Systems in interaction of complexity levels that are too large with respect to each other. So there's a gap. And as that gap widens, you get closer and closer to a surprise, a crash, or a break, if you like. And the collective mood of a population, the beliefs that a group holds about its future. If people are optimistic, they believe the next time period, next day, next month is going to be better than today, then you say it's positive mood. And if they're pessimistic, if they fear the future rather than welcoming it, then you say it's negative mood. And those two polarities give rise to completely different types of events. The spectrum of possibilities changes dramatically if the population is looking forward to the future as opposed to if they're fearing the future. So these two factors together, I would say, characterize this landscape of events. And of course, they're not fixed in time. They're changing all the time. So this landscape is like some kind of undulating structure where peaks become valleys and vice versa and flatten out and so on. And this is going on all the time. Okay, so that's the background. Let me show you a couple of examples. Here's a few examples of X events: global financial panics, crash of the internet, failure of air traffic control systems, and so on. And here are some actual living examples of each one of these kinds of X events. So they have happened. They will almost surely happen again. And as I mentioned yesterday, it would be a very good idea to start thinking about how to manage these kind of events. Preventing, I don't have too much optimism about that. Okay, now let's talk about complex systems and surprise. Okay, there are a variety of system theoretic notions, a few of them I've listed here: networks and connective structures, singularities in the process of emergent phenomena, centralized versus decentralized, and of course at the bottom we have this notion of resilience. All of these terms are sort of moving around at all times and interacting with each other in different ways to give you some behavioral properties of complex systems. The kinds of things that we would like to be able to get a better understanding of via a theory of what we call surprises. So just a couple of examples, since Lena's already giving me signs. Networks, here's a picture of the World Wide Web. It looks a lot like a slice of brain tissue, actually. But it's just, this is a minor fraction of the whole internet. The World Wide Web is only a small piece of the internet as a whole. And so if you wanted to have the internet itself up here, I doubt that anybody could create a meaningful picture. But it looks a lot like this, actually. It has a fractal structure. So it would look a lot like this, except it would occupy a lot more space. This is something, singularities, this picture is why I told you yesterday that the only place where there's any real action in time is where an existing trend is changing. And you see the only place where that happens in this picture, forget about point C, this never occurs in real life. It's only a mathematical point. But the other ones, A and B, they do occur. But in the set of all the time points here, they are a microscopically small fraction of all possible time points. They're very rare. But those are the points, if you actually knew what this curve looked like, they're the points where something is actually happening that's worth knowing about. Otherwise, the dotted regions are very boring. You can just say things will be tomorrow just like they are today, except it will follow a little better or a little worse. So the action in surprises is to try and get some handle on what's going on at these points A and B, and especially what's going on at points A and B where we don't know where points A and B are. We have no idea really where they are. So how do we infer we're getting near such a point from information that we do have? Because almost never do we have the description of this curve. We usually don't have any models. Or if we do, they're not as well specified as this picture might suggest. And in fact, what I told you about yesterday, complexity, social mood, and so on, these are not efforts in modeling. Those are not aimed at modeling the system, just the opposite. They're aimed at understanding the environment within which the system lives, the environment that constrains what the system can actually do. So that's what those notions of complexity, overload, and stuff are about. The landscape is not about the system, it's about the environment. Okay, so let me now give you a few questions toward a theory of surprise. What would we like a decent theory to allow us to do? Well, here's a few things. To anticipate where those points A and B are, there's singular points. To anticipate when an X event is coming up and get some insight into what it might be like, which one of those possible valleys, what the size of those valleys are, where you're more or less likely to end up, And finally, when? When is it going to happen? It will happen, but that's not much consolation. Knowing, or at least approximately, when it's going to happen would be very useful. Okay, now let me give you just an example of this notion. Here's a picture of the financial markets, in particular the Dow Jones Industrial Average in New York, from 1974 till about 2003. Now, suppose you didn't know about this part of it, and all you knew was this part. What you would say, and here's the trend. From 1978 until late 1999, it was basically onward and upward. And if you were a trend follower, at the end of 1999, you probably would have written in your blog on the internet, well, so far so good. Next year is going to be just like this year, except somewhat better. But in fact, next year wasn't somewhat better. This thing completely flattened out. And one can, I think, legitimately argue the end of the financial boom that this represents happened in the year 2000, and it still has not recovered in real terms. And I'll show you that in a moment. So how would you have got some sense back here in just roughly before that this whole picture was in a state of tectonically shifting? That's what a decent theory of surprise would give you some insight to. And you would like to also know, well, what if it does flatten out here? What's going to happen next? Well, here's what happened next. Here's 2000. So up till basically today. And here's what happened. And even though you read all sorts of wild statements about recoveries and all this kind of stuff in the newspaper, the real truth is the real Dow Jones average, normalized by the consumption expenditures index, or you could have used the price of gold, either would work. The real top was back here in 2000. There's no recovery. Only recovery is in nominal terms, nominal, but not in any relative terms. There's no recovery. And it's even, this picture is even more dramatic as if you use the price of gold, for example, and normalize the financial market indices that way. So it's a question, there's an issue here of what it is that you actually measure. And even with something as seemingly straightforward as a financial market index, what you measure can, and the conclusions you can draw from it, can be very widely different if you just measure the nominal number that you see in the newspaper, or if you ask, what does that really represent in actual buying power? Completely different stories. Okay, so let me now go to, here's another example, one that Lena likes, revolutionary political change. This is a picture of how both in the independent variables, which I call here A and B, have to do with political and economic ideologies and the kind of goals, societal goals, that those give rise to, those ideologies. And you can see what happens here in some of these regions here. These are delicate zones where you can have a rapid flip in social goals by a relatively small change in either political or economic ideology. And I won't go into the details because Lena's going to start waving in a minute. But this is the kind of thing you'd also like to have for a theory of surprise, because the surprise areas are right on the edges of these crosshatched zones. Those are where discontinuous changes take place, with small changes in the inputs and big changes in the outputs. So, and here's another last one. Well, yeah, basically last, about timing. And recognize that events do not, they have a kind of dimensional character. Some events are high dimensional events, and some are very low dimensional events. And when they interact with each other, you get pictures of this kind. I can't even begin to go into details about how this actually works, certainly not in the next 2 minutes. But the point is that as you move in time, sometimes these dimensions of the events can change. They can be shrunk down to lower dimensional events or expand out to higher dimensional events. And they're interconnected by an object of this type. It's called a simplicial complex. And it's not very hard to understand, actually, when you see a couple of examples, but maybe I can do something like that later if we have time. So finally, I'll close this with a list of references, but here you see by one of my favorite authors even, where you can find a kind of, I think, relatively easy to read and understand account. That stuff on multidimensional time is one of the chapters in this book. And these other two books are more recent, but these each have to do with one of the two drivers of the landscape of events. So in short, to have a decent theory of surprise, I think that we need to be able to create a theory that fills in all the boxes and arrows in this diagram that I showed you yesterday. Okay, so that's it.